Hello, friends, and welcome to Journal the Body podcast. I'm your host, Abby Fernandini. Today I'm sitting in front of my red light therapy. I've got a couple books out in front of me, including The Web That Has No Weaver, which is the traditional Chinese medicine book I've been taking a little dig in. And I just got back into New York City after having a wonderful holiday with family in North Carolina. Missing the North Carolina already. Um, every time I get back into New York, I feel like it's like such an adjustment for me. So just taking it nice and slow, kind of like nesting in my apartment with Selva right now. And yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about colds and flu and viruses and bacteria and all the things that seem to be going around this winter slash, I would say late fall. So you caught a cold, dun dun dun. That was like me I would say that was me like 2 or 3 weeks ago. I had a solid cold for a little bit that I couldn't kick. And I would say that going from one climate, which would be Florida, to New York, and having a pretty radical change in not only like geography, but also climate. I haven't lived in a cold in a very long time, and I've been in the sun getting like way more vitamin D and also eating completely different, etc. Um, from Florida compared to that, and which is now in New York. So I feel like my immunity plus being pregnant, it's been a little different. So I've had to really like be stringent with some good protocols. And I'm here to share those today with you. So let's start out with, okay, so you've got a cold coming on, or let's say it's actually worse. Let's say you've got the flu coming on and your whole family has the flu and you're getting those symptoms and you're like, oh gosh, here it comes. Let's talk about first off what we won't do. Okay. I would say the number one thing that I would bet the average American family reaches for is going to be acetaminophen. So again, Tylenol, and that's pretty much for, I would say, all ages. You know, you see this pull towards, hey, like, let's reduce the fever if we're getting sick. And in my opinion, that's probably one of the worst things you can do, especially, again, according to traditional Chinese medicine. That's not even just like a me thing. That is before these medical interventions and these pharmaceuticals were developed, you let the fever run its course. You let the fever do its thing. So, and this is for all ages. So I wanted to read a couple of things that I found super interesting about fever suppression and why we need to take a second. Yeah, we just need to have a second thought about why we do that and, what it's going to turn into in the long term, especially if we're doing it with young children. So until the intervention of aspirin and other fever suppressing drugs came around, doctors believed that the fever helped the body, and they actually used fever therapy to treat ailments such as syphilis, tuberculosis, and even mania. New studies are finding that fever suppression may not be exactly what the body needs. These studies show that fever stimulates antibody production specific to infection, stimulates the productions of interferons, stimulates the production of more white blood cells, and even directly kills invading organisms through heat. So, again, going back to the basics, the body is intuitive, the body knows what it's doing, and here we come waltzing in with these interventions that don't always make a lot of sense. And again, even if I'm just getting a cold or I feel like maybe I have a high viral load in my throat, etc., if I'm just feeling off, I actually will go and induce a fever and I'll go and sit in the sauna, because that is really what the sauna is. It basically heats the body up to a certain degree where it kind of has similar effects to the way a fever would on viral load. So we have this as this amazing like immunity protocol, yet, people are still going to grab Tylenol off the counter when they actually do come down with a fever. Just a caveat though there, I am not doing sauna while I'm pregnant, because there's a lot of contraindications, of course, for heating a fetus. So There is that. But let me continue with some more of the studies on fever suppression. So, a study published in the Journal of Allergy and Immunology followed over 800 children from the suburban Detroit, Michigan. Clinic records from their first year were extracted for episodes of fever, antibiotic use, and respiratory infections. The researchers found that children with fevers before the age of 1 year old were far less likely to demonstrate allergic sensitivities at ages 6 to 7 years old. There's another study published in Natural Immunity that showed elevating the internal temperature in mice to mimic a fever increases the number of immune cells that are recruited to the lymph nodes, where these cells are educated and armed to seek out and destroy offending pathogens. And finally, several scientific papers have documented the regression of tumors in patients who contracted a serious infection and had a high fever. How much better to develop an immunity to cancer by having an occasional fever during childhood? So it's almost like fevers in childhood, for example, really lay the groundwork for what we see, again, later on in life. And not only that, but I was doing some more digging today and came across a really great post. And it was talking about another study that said that there was a study of over 20,000 children done, and it suggested that giving the popular medicine Tylenol, even as infrequency as once per year, could have a permanent effect. As much as one time a month actually raises a child's asthma risk by 540%. And I will go on record and say I was one of those children as a kid growing up with asthma that did not have a good time. And, you gotta wonder if some of those interventions had played a role in any of that. And then, so again, I'm reading out of this book, The Nourishing Traditions, Book of Baby and Childcare. It's basically kind of like what I've been going off of for pregnancy, but it's really applicable for immunity for ourselves, for our families, really for all ages, regardless of like what stage in life you're at. So that's kind of why I'm referencing it. And then it says, in recent years, doctors have been asking whether the suppression of a fever in children results is a predisposition to cancer later in life, and even whether fevers during childhood is a body's strategy for creating immunity for life to this dreadful disease. So there is this interesting theory coming about that I'd say hasn't been studied well enough to understand the implications, but fevers in childhood could very well be a huge, huge beneficial factor against cancer later in life. And like I said, I don't know enough about this, but it's just something to really think about there. And then the other thing that I do want to mention is when it's not appropriate to use home remedies, especially like for your children. I think when you're pushing, I think in emergencies kind of considered when you're pushing, or your child, I should say, is pushing like 104-degree fever. That's when you need to probably think about emergency care, because there is the threshold in which it begins to affect the body. You can start seeing convulsions. There's a lot of things that can be really dangerous, especially for a young child. So, we love home remedies and we love natural intervention, but sometimes there is always a time and place for, more serious medical intervention. And I think that's always a good thing to keep in mind. And then really the same thing goes for example, like pregnant women. I did have a slight fever when I was sick this past like month. And it just barely reached 100. And 100 is kind of the threshold for pregnant women where it's not serious enough to like need to seek medical intervention, but you actually do have to be a lot more careful with fevers, because when the fetus gets too hot, it poses a lot of risks to fetal development, the nervous system, etc. So it's always good to think about that. And so there's actually a method called like lemon socks. And I guess you like put these socks on, and I think they like, maybe you heat the water and it's like warm water or something, and you put lemons at the bottom of your socks, and lemons are used as a way to cool the body down. Another method that is, again, a little bit more, you can do this on children. You as an adult, it can also be super beneficial to reducing a high fever, but cool water enemas is a great way to internally cool the body down, especially if you're dealing with, for example, for older adults, it is serious when you do have 104-degree fever, but one way that you can actually pretty effectively reduce this fever is by doing a cold water enema. Now, is it the most pleasant thing in the world? Probably not, but you got to you're not in a good state of mind, in that situation anyway. So it's just a matter of, it's going to be uncomfortable, but this is another technique that seems to work. So those are just some tidbits. Another thing too is that your child can sip on, like, for example, you or your child, like I would say this goes for both ages, but you can sip on 50% diluted fresh juice to help keep like yourself hydrated and also your blood sugars normal, like in a normal range, because I think the number one thing that most people are worried about, especially with a fever, is the dehydration component. So like having electrolytes and trace minerals on hand is super important to think about, and just constantly be kicking back fluids. And diluted fruit juice is actually like a kind of a decent way to do that with both the electrolytes and helping with the blood sugar component. So that is another thing that you can try. Now going on to gut health and viral load. It seems like gut health plays like a huge role in our responses to viruses and also bacteria. Now, the gut health itself, there's a million different factors that can kind of play into this. And what I've noticed personally for myself is that moving from Florida, which is a very like damp, humid climate, to New York, which is a very cold, dry climate, it's definitely had impacts on my gut health because I was eating two different ways. And also I probably have some things to correct anyway in my gut, including, just like probably parasite cleansing once I'm done being pregnant, and some of these other modalities of cleansing that I definitely talk a lot about. But it's really interesting to see the way that your diet changes going from climate to climate, and also how that can impact your gut health. Now, I'm going to kind of put a blanket statement out there. If you're not eating healthy and you're not eating nose to tail and you're not eating whole foods, I have a feeling that your gut health is not in great condition. And of course, classic signs of that, if we're starting with the basics, are going to be bloating, gas, constipation, IBS, colitis, in a lot of cases, acne can showcase, an imbalanced microbiome, which is something that I've had to deal with a little bit because it's a genetic predisposition in my family, and all my family have been on Accutane. So I have to do a lot to try to keep my gut health and, organ health in check, for clear skin. But again, that's another rabbit hole. But like I said, all in all, if you're experiencing these symptoms, these gut symptoms, there's a lot more of a predisposition for you to actually come down with a pretty bad viral infection or a bacterial infection, etc. And the body really does a great job at giving us signs that this is the case. And this is increased, just like mucus and phlegm day to day. This can be increased earwax. This can be, that feeling in the back of your throat that's just like kind of coated. This can be shown on your tongue that you have gut imbalances. Again, stool is another great way to determine if you're having gut issues. Again, there's such a wide range of things. It can be really easy to figure out pretty quickly that you are having gut imbalances. Now, it's not as easy to figure out what's causing them. But a lot of times I like to go for the major offenders, which are going to be like the GMO foods, soy, wheat, soy, wheat, corn, a lot of those foods that are monocropped, especially gluten, since it's such a high glyphosate containing product. And if you're coming down with a cold or flu, I know this goes against a lot of like what the pro-metabolic community stands for, but removing dairy and gluten pretty quickly is one of the number one ways to help beat a virus or bacterial infection, because the reality is that if you have an imbalanced gut or gut microbiome, those two food groups, dairy and gluten, are going to impact you. And especially dairy, it's going to increase the amount of lymphatic drainage you're experiencing. So phlegm, mucus, you're going to have an increase in mucus production, and that's never fun. So always removing those foods as you're starting to notice symptoms can be really, really helpful in, just overcoming a virus or a cold. So this is something interesting. Again, during COVID, there was a high association of an imbalanced microbiome in the gut to long COVID symptoms. So they were able to correlate these people with disrupted guts to basically long COVID symptoms. And then also on the flip side, people who had pretty good guts intact, they were able to excrete the viral load out a lot quicker in their stool. So they were able to recover faster. So there was a huge tie in gut health with viral load. And I think that that's really interesting and just something to be highly aware of when you're thinking about, how to keep high immunity. It starts in the gut. And if you think about like the gut as a whole, if you start out with an imbalanced microbiome, this gives way to gut permeation, which again, a lot of people call it leaky gut. It can just cause a whole host of different symptoms. The bottom line is that it increases inflammation. This can then lead to a high bacterial load, and of a high viral load as well. And then that's when your severe viral symptoms begin, and you can be dealing with things like cytokine storms, which you heard a lot of like people with COVID ended up having. So it's kind of this cyclical, fiasco that goes underway when you're dealing with a stressed gut and then a high viral load, and they just kind of like, it really just feeds itself. So, talking about immunity protocols in traditional Chinese medicine, and I think I read like this had clinical studies. This is like a tea that they use to act pretty quickly, I would say, when it comes to the onset of, an illness. And the TCM tea that they use a lot is a stalk of scallions, 10 slices of ginger, and then they use brown sugar, but my recommendation would be some form of raw local honey and making that into a tea. So that is a classic, like traditional Chinese medicine tea, broth, whatever you want to call it. The other thing to really be focusing on when you are feeling sick is actually your oral health, because a lot of times in the back of our throats, the viral load tends to fester. Those lymph nodes right on the sides tend to get pretty overwhelmed pretty quickly. And so things like tongue scraping, things like oil pulling, and also salt gargling are really, really good for reducing viral load. So that's another great just hack, is being overly stringent with your oral health while you're feeling the onset of those symptoms. And then foods that I love to use for the flu are going to include squash, cinnamon, grapefruit, ginger, like bee propolis, garlic, a ton of bone broth, and like foods that contain like lots of glycine, So you're looking at bone broth, bone marrow, even miso broth and some of those other things can be really beneficial. Apple cider vinegar is going to support that gut health, especially. And it can also really promote good bacteria to kind of come in and do the work as well. And then cranberries are also great, especially during this season. Pomegranates. These are all great foods to be incorporating that are going to have just really, really high vitamin and mineral content that your body's going to be cycling through, especially quickly. If you are, undergoing things like fevers, you've got to understand that your minerals are going to be cycling. You're going to be sweating a ton, your minerals / electrolytes are going to be really depleted. And eating foods that just really combat that are going to be especially important. Don't go to the grocery store and just buy Campbell's chicken noodle soup, because although it's great to eat warming foods and I highly recommend it, it's just, it's always good to kind of find the clean version, the stuff that is not just full of MSG and other, preservatives that could in fact kickstart like inflammation even further. And in terms of supplementation, cod liver oil is super important, because what happens is the fever and the inflammatory like response that occurs during these infections, they rapidly use vitamin A. So, and cod liver oil has like a great vitamin A to vitamin D ratio. So they tend to like rapidly burn through vitamin A. And so you can become really depleted in this fat soluble vitamin at the end of a virus. So it's really good to kind of definitely get some high quality cod liver oil like Rosita's or Droppy. And I can link that. I'll link a few things in the show notes so that you guys can take a look. Other modalities that are cheap and effective are going to include sitting in the sun. Okay. And I don't have that luxury here in New York unless I go sit in the park in the cold and get, 15 minutes of sun or walk to the waterway. And it can be kind of, tough to get yourself to do that on a sick day. Red light therapy has been my best friend up here in the north, because I really do think that it kind of tends to supplement where you are not getting as much sunlight. It also helps my mood, and I just feel like it's really been able to help me combat my seasonal like kind of depressive symptoms that I would otherwise probably be feeling pretty bad right now. So red light therapy is great. Oregano oil, having oil of oregano is crucial. I would say if you are sick, it's good to take it for like a couple days to a week or two. Anything longer can actually be kind of taxing on the liver, just because it is such a potent antiviral, that it can have those effects after a certain amount of time and be contraindicated. But like high dose oregano oil while you're going through a sickness, there are studies that literally show that it can be more potent and beneficial than an antibiotic use. It's actually outperformed some antibiotics in some clinical studies. So it's crazy that they don't tout it the way that they probably could. And it also doesn't become antibiotic resistant like antibiotics, and those strains of bacteria, do. So that's a really cool caveat there. I also tend to grab, like, for example, I grabbed eucalyptus from the farmer's market, hung a bunch in my shower. So like steam showers were great for just opening up the nasal passages. Again, you can do nasal flushes, just anything that kind of moves the fluid and kind of gets, like, even walking is great to make sure that you're not getting like overly stagnant lymph. When it becomes stagnant is when you start to feel like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a long time before this ends up, subsiding. And using things called expectorants are also great. So expectorants are herbs typically. So ginger, thyme, orange peel would be a great tea to make, using expectorants that are going to actually make you cough up phlegm. They're going to, basically instigate this excretion of virus or viral load. Now, I don't recommend necessarily doing it before bed, some of these teas, like if you were to go for like an expectorant tea of ginger, thyme, and orange peel, because they can make you cough all night because you're in this state now that you've kind of almost activated this this coughing I don't even know what to call it, this coughing fit where you're trying to like kind of cough up mucus, etc. And so it's always good to do that like midday so you can breathe easy at night. Other stuff that I like to use, be propolis, like especially like I use that as a throat coating spray that really helps, again, take care of viral load in the back of the throat. Bee pollen is also another great way to, support that immunity. Essential oils I also love. Like I love diffusing just a tiny bit of cinnamon essential oil. That tends to kind of just like feels like it kind of clears the room a little bit, and people have their opinions on essential oils. I personally use them and really like them and see positive benefits. So yeah, I love to use certain essential oils to help promote, just all around feeling a little bit better. Lots of warming foods, tons of broths. I love to eat lots of rice, warm veggies, nothing cold. According to traditional Chinese medicine, eating cold food, drinking cold liquids, etc., can cause more harm than good. It also slows the digestion, and it can actually kind of create a stagnant gut, especially when, you're in an overwhelmed state like this. But definitely focusing on those warming foods, especially if you're in a cold climate. If you're in a warmer climate, it is a little bit different. And eat things that are being grown locally and seasonally around where you are, because they're going to have natural properties that are going to promote just healing and potent immunity effects. Avoid, and I had to learn this the hard way because I was a ding dong and I did this. I thought I was all better, even though I kind of felt like a little sick still. And but I was like coming off of it, like a few days of just not feeling the best. And I went for a massage. Worst mistake that I could have done, because what I ended up actually doing is moving a bunch of lymph in my body that a little bit too much and activated my immune response heavily. So that night that I got a massage, I ended up inducing a fever. And the first night it was a 99.5 fever. And then the second day I was battling like close, if not hit 100-degree fever, which was, it's always a little bit nerve-wracking when you're pregnant, because that's just, it's a whole nother ball game. So do not get massages. Don't get lymphatic massages. Don't rub your, like, don't, overly stimulate your lymph nodes or try to do too much lymph drainage unless there are regions that are not sensitive, because you can just end up kickstarting like an over response to, it's just like an over, I don't even know. It just, I ended up with a fever. So, and I've read that it's not necessarily the best approach. So wait till a lot of the viral load has cleared out naturally. And then, you can resume some of that stuff. So that was a lot. I don't know if I just overwhelmed everybody, but I think if I had to sum it up with a couple of takeaways here, it would be, whatever you do, do not lower your fever, first off. Okay. Second of all, eat tons of foods that are local, that are seasonal, that are warming, broths. Of course, this is nothing new to people. That not cold foods in traditional Chinese medicine. Get teas, expectorant teas. Try to do them during the day so you're not coughing all night. Take care of your oral health. Okay, salt gargling, staying on top of it, even tongue scraping, and get some cod liver oil for vitamin A, because you're going to be burning through that at a pretty quick pace with these infections. So that's it, guys. That's my rant on cold and flu immunity. So let me know if you guys have any questions. Send me some DMs. I know that was a lot. Next week, I'm going to actually do a podcast on I think like probably going to hit like overarching biohacks, and or we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into things that I'm not doing for pregnancy versus things that I am doing for pregnancy. And kind of debunking some of the myths and some of the fear mongering that happens around pregnancy. So if that's one episode or if that's actually 2 episodes in the next couple of weeks, we'll see how it plays out. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.